Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and I am back from the North American Fan Festival for Final Fantasy XIV here in 2018, our third North American Fan Festival, teasing our third expansion, Shadowbringers. Now, I've got a lot of pieces to do on the Fan Festival, from covering several of the panels, to the lore book, to the press conference that we're going to be looking at today. No doubt some of you are already well aware of some of the contents that came out of this press conference, and it's one of many controversial aspects we are going to be covering on the channel. I'm going to be sharing my opinion on. So, at Fan Festival on the Friday evening, several of us media were invited to a press conference where, sort of like free form, they'd hand the microphone to somebody, they'd ask a question. Yoshida and his translator Aime would go about translating it, and then we'd move on to the next person. We had about an hour for this, and we were basically just told don't ask about Blue Mage because they were going to talk about Blue Mage the next day. But there are some good questions in here. And then there's one question in particular that's been making the rounds amongst the Final Fantasy XIV community. In fact, I'm definitely going to be sharing my opinion on that question when we get to it here. Now, on the screen, we are actually using the write-up that came from Gamer Escape. Now, we are good friends with Gamer Escape, and we always share their content whenever we have a great reason to. And this was a great reason. I have my own notes right here in front of me, and I'll be looking down at those. But for those of you wishing to read along at what the questions are and a general answer that Yoshida did provide, then be sure to direct your eyes into the screen and follow along. So without further ado, let us get started. So the first question is, with Shadowbringers, you didn't describe the areas like you were going to, or like you had in the prior expansions. Was that intentional? Now, he immediately acknowledges that that is a good question and starts talking about the Warrior of Light becoming the Warrior of Darkness. So they really don't want to talk about exactly where we're going. Obviously, Ilsabard is a big thing. It's where the Garlemald Empire actually resides. However, there's a lot of things going around the community regarding what could be other possibilities. People have suggested we might go to Thavnair, for example. And on top of that, with all this mess with the Warrior of Darkness bit and Ardbert and his shard coming into play, there is the question of if we will visit another shard at any point here and go to those areas as well. It is definitely odd that they didn't go too far into revealing, other than that we would take down the Garlean Empire, but it was just I'm glad they said it was a good question, because it means that when the details are finally revealed, there's probably a good chance that we're going to be looking forward to those details as we normally do. Please look forward to it. Hi. They didn't want to spoil 4.5 was also a major reason. I'm assuming the Gimlet Dark, the new dungeon, is going to be a big reason for that. So be sure to keep your eyes peeled for more patch 4.5 stuff. Now, second question, I believe this was asked by Frosty. It's a PvP question, so he's usually a pretty good source on those things right there. And it's fair. We heard almost nothing of PvP in the actual opening keynote. And, as much as some of us like to meme on PvP, after the amazing performance that was put on by Square Enix for the Feast Regional Championship, I am looking forward to more Feast-related stuff. So I'm glad that he decided to ask this. What can we expect from PvP going into Shadowbringers? So first, they said they wanted to focus on the finals of the Feast Championship, and they're going to continue the momentum with PvP after that. They did say there would be PvP announcements during the live letter, through which we found that there was a new Rival Wings map, the Hidden Gorge, and that there's going to be some rule changes compared to the previous one. I personally didn't really enjoy the changes to PvP in this expansion. It didn't help that my favorite job, Monk, was also I really didn't like what they did with that in PvP. But unfortunately, they didn't have too much more to share. We don't know what any major changes are going to be to PvP, how they've reflected on the feedback to PvP this season, and in fact, over the last several seasons throughout Stormblood. So fingers crossed that some changes that I'm more in favor of come forward, and that the PvP community, who, actually consumes the content the majority of the time, they're the ones who you definitely need to be pleasing, at least as a baseline. So the next question was about 32-bit support dropping. They really wanted to know what it was they were going to accomplish with that. This is a similar question we got to when the PS3 support was dropped in the previous expansion, or when our current expansion actually released. So there's two reasons, and they're very similar to the reasons why we dropped PS3 support. The percentage of players playing on 32-bit is very low. In fact, they gave a number of 1.8%, as it says on the screen. And second, the memory maximum is 2 gigabytes, which is 1/4 of the PS4. So because of that, it creates a bottleneck, in which if they ever want to or need to allocate more memory for certain things, they can't. They always have to keep that 32-bit in mind. So with that removal, they should be able to do more with memory allocation, or if they need more memory allocation, they don't have to worry about the 32-bit systems bottlenecking that. Moving on to the next one, any plans to grow data centers in the Oceanic region? I believe this question came out of Ethis, obviously asking on behalf of Australia and the rest of the Oceanic community. They said there's no plans at the moment, but they specifically said that they had not presented a plan to it to the CEO, Matsuda-san. Now, Matsuda-san was in the room, so he's now been somewhat presented the idea of expanding into an oceanic region. So they said they recognize that they're seeing growth there. Some areas of the world, some environments have very high latency that makes it hard to enjoy the game. And obviously, when the time is right, they'd like to progress into expanding into these regions. It's a very political answer that doesn't really say there's any plans going forward, as opposed to just saying, like, obviously we want to do all we can and we will when we can, but there wasn't really any initiative being taken there. And I do think at this point that the Oceanic region definitely needs support. It very much mimics the why does the game not support the Spanish language, which is not the same as a data center question, but that the game could be better supported in regions that aren't North America, Europe, and Japan. And I definitely support that because I do know quite some people who come by the stream and that comment on the YouTube section that are playing in very unfavorable environments and could definitely use a better playing experience altogether. Moving on to the next question. What else can you tell us about the trust system, and are you trying to make Final Fantasy XIV more like a single-player game? Another pretty decent question. The trust system was kind of dropped on us out of nowhere. I don't think any of us really expected that system to be making an appearance here in Final Fantasy XIV based on its Final Fantasy XI counterpart. Now, the good thing about MMOs is that you can play with people, but sometimes people who they suffer from some sort of anxiety, or they really enjoy the Final Fantasy franchise more as a single-player game. And with that, especially with the main story quests, they would like to allow the option for people to enjoy the main story as single-player focused as they possibly can. Now, obviously, it's always going to be more efficient to be playing with other people. We've seen squadrons in some of the higher-end dungeons that they're allowed to access. They just generally don't perform as well as having a normal player, and the option instead is to make them so powerful that, you know, they kind of bypass the need to do a fair portion of the mechanics. So, playing through with the main story quests with the NPCs, this will get harder and harder as time progresses because, as we've seen with squadrons, it's just not the most efficient means as opposed to having actual players most of the time. But with this, they're going to be able to not only approach the main story as comfortably as possible, therefore they kind of open up the MMO to a more general player base who may just want to enjoy it for its specific aspects. They're also allowing players who have anxiety to kind of get a feel for what it's like to be in a dungeon. You know, what does this dungeon do? Can I practice this dungeon before going in with other players? It opens up a few more possibilities to maybe help them get through their anxiety or give them a baseline through which to set themselves as an example. Obviously, NPCs don't perform the same as players. You know, speed runs of dungeons and stuff, probably not as effective when running through with stuff like trusts. But having that baseline experience to judge how other players might expect you to play is better than having no baseline at all and going in relatively clueless. So it's going to be an interesting system to see pan out, and Yoshida seems to really just want to support another type of player within the MMO, who he seems to believe everyone should be able to enjoy it as much as they possibly want, whether they're playing solo or with friends. Now, the next question was about raid meta, and this question, I thought it was a little bit, what's the word for it? It was a little bit of projection in regards to, you know, what is considered acceptable and what isn't. The full question was, the raid meta is pretty defined with which jobs are used. With new jobs, are there plans to address this in 5.0? I think you and I both know that mathematically there's always going to be a winner. Now, unless you make everything completely homogenized, that's a damn near impossibility. You can make things close enough that anything can be an option, but I don't think you're ever going to hit that true sweet point where that this question, you know, ever really is never asked. From what they've observed in AlphaScape, and honestly from what I've observed in AlphaScape, the distribution is pretty even. They want to keep addressing balance as they would always, and with Shadowbringers, of course, they want to revisit balance, and I like this, they want to put another layer of focus on balance. Now, we've seen this a lot, because throughout several expansions now, we see where there's jobs that are unfavored, and they get a little push, right? And they're a little better, but they're still not quite there, because the other job's just offering more. Then they get another push, and another push. And then eventually, at some point, they just kind of hit this breaking point where they're just god tier and one of the best jobs to take. This didn't always happen. Paladin was memed on throughout all of Heavensward, and Dark Knight, while its performance has been absolutely fine, the actual design of the job, along with Machinist, has been regularly criticized throughout all of the Shadowbringers expansion. So with that, having an extra layer of focus on balance, maybe those things don't take as long to get through. Maybe there's a better channel of feedback between us and the developers themselves. So it's good to hear that. We need to see it in execution, and I'm glad to see that they do have a greater focus on balance going into the next expansion, especially with more jobs being added. Then comes this question. So this question's the one that a lot of us media have been kind of just shaking our heads at, because we really wish that this didn't happen and didn't exist. So in the middle of this 1 hour limited time we had with Yoshida-san, somebody thought it would be a wonderful idea to ask, players are running cyber sex brothels in 14. Does Square Enix have a position on this? Now keep in mind, like I said, we are reading the Gamer Escape, the Gamer Escape write-up of the event. It was not Gamer Escape who asked this question. I believe I've actually read the article of the outlet who asked this question at this point, and it depresses me because the article was so well written for the first, 40%. Then this pops up, and there's just such a lack of remorse regarding what it is actually going on here. Just because Kotaku reported on something that had been happening in MMOs ages ago, seems like now, this super limited time after the announcement of our next expansion, is the perfect time to ask a question like this. Does Square Enix have a position on this? Yoshida, as politely as he could, just said, hey, we have a user agreement, and everyone agrees to it, and if you break a rule, or break a law, then account bans and, all that are obviously going to be a thing. The common sense answer. What's Square Enix's stance on it? This was the most disrespectful thing I've ever seen in an interview that has ever happened. Interview, press conference, anything. How could you possibly think this is an acceptable question to ask in this sort of environment? There are so many stories from various other media about this, and just how disgusted those of us who were there were. People just wondering how much time could they possibly waste. And then after Yoshida had done the courtesy, this very patient man and his very patient translator had gone through the effort of translating a real answer for this. The guy then said, well, no, I mean, it's consensual, but it's still paid. To which Yoshida replied, moshine, which basically means, yeah, no, that's not acceptable. That you get banned for that too. Just, no, basically what it means. I'm so angry that this had to happen. I wasted ink on this, okay? Ask Very Merry what happened with him on this, because this just gets me heated so much. I just want to move on to the next one. The next question. When did he decide to create FanFest and make the announcement about Shadowbringers? This seems like it is coming from another media who doesn't really play Final Fantasy XIV. I'm not sure the media that did ask this, but FanFest, obviously, it's been around for years. This is the third of the series of fan festivals. But I do like Yoshida's answer to this question was a lot less about this FanFest and Shadowbringers. It was more about the idea behind doing FanFest in the first place. 8 years ago, he took on rebuilding 14. At the time, he had no idea. It would have been crazy that all of this was happening. His goal was to fix the game and grow it, and to be able to do awesome things like fan festivals. And by having this celebration plus new announcements, it becomes even more fun and meaningful. He took a question that didn't really feel like it had too much place in this kind of setting and turned it into a pretty heartwarming answer. So thank you, Yoshida, for sharing that. It's always great hearing about things like the journey throughout Final Fantasy XIV. We've heard it a billion times, but there's always new details cropping up along the way that kind of make it a little bit more interesting every time we hear about it. Moving forward, what can you tell us about the limited jobs? Now, obviously, we learned more about this during the live letter. I'm not going to go into that right now because that's a whole nother video in itself. Stand by for tomorrow's letter from the producer live. We can't really talk too much about that question. The next one was, what can you tell us about that endgame content for Disciples of Hand or Land? Is it literally just rebuilding Ishgard? I believe Sly was actually the one who asked this. And Yoshida replied, there's going to be a lot of new content, but rebuilding is a big addition. Rebuilding the Holy See, as they mentioned during the opening keynote, a lot of players have been like, when can we fix it? When are we going to be able to live there? And this is becoming, hopefully, a vessel through which we can achieve some of those things. The rebuilding of Ishgard, it has its own story. They can't go into the narrative, but you'll be able to interact with the game for an extended period of time. It's not something you'll log in and just do instantly and then be done with it. This will be end game content. It will involve difficult recipes and or bragging rights for being able to create some of the difficult recipes. Bragging rights is something that people are always asking for more of in Final Fantasy XIV, but they're things that anyone could achieve. And this seems to be something they're going about with the rebuilding of Ishgard. And I look forward to seeing what people are going to be able to build that really is a bragging right. And how the Holy See is going to look when we're all done and finished with it. I might even pick up the Hand or Land just to try and make my little bit of contribution to it. Also because I want to understand the system and how it actually works. I expect to be terrible at it. All right, quick cut in the video, no big deal. So let's move on to the next question. Do you plan to add more content related or similar to the Rathalos fight? Excellent question. I think a lot of us are wondering when and if we will see more challenging 4-man content available in the game, something they've always been adverse to adding, and it doesn't look like that's going to be changing anytime soon. The potential is there, but there's just no plans at the moment. After Shadowbringers, there's always a possibility. That's a pretty far-fetched answer. There's nothing really there to indicate that it is actually being talked about or being worked on, but we'll just have to hold out hope. The Rathalos fight, while not super challenging, was a nice change of pace to the 4-man structure of the game. So anything that breaks that conventional structure, I'm usually a welcoming fan of. Moving on to the next question, with the merging of TP and MP, which, by the way, if you missed that from the opening keynote, is a very important battle detail regarding Shadowbringers, the UI needs to undergo a massive change. I don't know if it's a massive change, but it definitely needs to undergo a change. What can you tell us about UI changes going to Shadowbringers? Again, a fairly, pretty fair question, I feel. Asking about the UI is something that we kind of always forget about until we see things like job gauge information and stuff like that, and other changes they've made, like the main scenario quest follower and the which also lets you follow the job quest as well. Moving into this one, I feel like, is my question missing? Like my question is missing. My question is definitely missing from here. That's fine. I have my own question written down right here. So anyway, with any MMO, you're always keeping track of various elements in the game. From an engineering standpoint, it's actually not too difficult, but they have to be careful to balance it. The UI team is certainly struggling through this transition, which is not really too much of a surprise altogether. Not really too much to say. They didn't go into too many specific details regarding the UI overall, and just making sure there weren't any other questions that I missed as I go through my notes. Looks like all the rest of the questions are there. It was just, did I skip past it in my own thing? No, yeah, it would have been between this question and this question. All right, I'll come back to it at the end. No biggie. Why no Spanish language option? Some Square Enix games have been translated to Spanish, but those were standalone games. Final Fantasy XIV, with the live setting and updating, the translators need to work with the development team. Square Enix works with localization teams, but the present Square Enix doesn't have a Spanish language team to do the localization for 14. Was that from this? Yeah, hold on. I have many languages are available, but not Spanish. Yeah, I have it in my notes right here. For some reason, I mixed this up with the live Q&A that came the next day. I think, I never really thought of it. Spanish is a language in the U.S. I think over 50% of our population speaks Spanish. And on top of that, that's not even including the countries that actually speak Spanish. But it never occurred to me that our game isn't in Spanish. And that's pretty crazy to me. So I'm hoping, again, this kind of goes back to the Oceanic thing, and I mentioned it earlier when I brought up the Oceanic thing about the Spanish translation. It shocks me. I hope there is some sort of initiative to make it available in more languages, because a language that's that spoken feels like a language that should probably be supported, you know what I mean? So fingers crossed for the Spanish community that they will get some sort of official support regarding translations for Spanish. And the last question that's on here, but not the last question for the press conference, the content is incredibly polished, but the cycle is pretty standardized as far as types of content and timing. What are you looking to do with Shadowbringers? This is another classic. What are you going to do to break up the content cycle? And yes, just checking my notes, that is indeed the last question we have here. It's pretty much the same answer we always get. In order to keep up with that 16, 17 week patch cycle that we have, we have to have those baseline things that we always have, the dungeons, the raids, the 24-mans, all the stuff that we always say is the same every patch. It needs to be there. It's the structure through which they build upon. And then we see other things of content. And it's not that they haven't done other types of content. They have, Eureka took 3 tries to get it right, in my opinion, but you have Eureka, you have our deep dungeons with Palace of the Dead and Heaven on High. They have been trying to give us other forms of content outside of that, some unique experience. Rathalos comes to mind with the collaboration. Hopefully we get something unique for the 15 collab as well, but who the heck knows? We didn't get any information about it this live letter. And then this was probably our first red flag about what was going to happen the next day with Blue Mage, because at this press conference, they said that's why they added Eureka, Deep Dungeon, and soon Blue Mage. They didn't speak about it like a job, they spoke about it like content. We now know that that's a pretty accurate way to describe it, so this was kind of everyone's first glimpse at, yeah, maybe Blue Mage isn't exactly what we think it is, or maybe that limited job thing means something we maybe didn't initially think. But Yoshida says a lot of people don't seem to count those kind of things into consideration of breaking the patch cycle. They are making the effort, and they hope that people will support the dev team as they continue to make efforts. And, as long as they make decent efforts, 4.5 is looking to be a patch full of all sorts of content. It's likely that Gold Saucer Edition is going to be Blitzball. A new Rival Wings PvP map that's going to have its own set of rules on top of what we've already established with Rival Wings. We are going to be getting Blue Mage and this limited job system that we've never had before. We're going to be getting the 4th zone of Eureka with Hydatos, which is going to have this public dungeon system that is hopefully a better version of what we got out of the Diadem emergency mission. So it's looking to be a very unconventional patch on top of the usual conventions that we're used to having in those types of situations, or in those types of patches. So fingers crossed that those things are successful and continue to be successful. I am looking forward to hopefully some more systematic changes going into some of those things in 5.x, especially the deep dungeon, which I really think they could explore a lot more. He didn't even mention it. Treasure maps is another thing that's on this list. One of my favorite activities in the game. So fingers crossed that they get a little bit more recognition for those things, or that those things continue to evolve in such a way that maybe they earn those recognitions a little bit more in the forefront of content development. Now, going back, I had asked a question as well that I don't know why it's missing from this. Fusion, did you write this up? How could you forget me? So anyway, there's my question I asked, and of course it had to be a raid-related question. I asked about Ultimate in 5.x. I specifically asked, so in 4.1 we had the Ultimate Coil of Bahamut, and in 4.3 we had the Weapons Refrain. We were all pretty distraught to learn that in patch 4.5 we would not be receiving another Ultimate. Sorry, my phone just went off. Stop it. Stop it. Anyway, so we were all pretty distraught to learn that we were not going to be receiving a new Ultimate in 4.5. What is the content plan for Ultimates going into 5.x? Should we expect one in 5.1, 5.3, and 5.5? Or should we expect it to follow a similar suit to what we received in Stormblood? I was basically trying to get, are we getting 2 or 3 Ultimates in the 5.x series? And the answer leads me to believe that we might be leaning towards a 3 Ultimate encounters. Fingers crossed, there's no guarantee. We learned during one of the panels that there are 3 battle designers who are capable of making ultimate level content. 2 of them made Weapons Refrain and UCOB, and the third one did not make the third Ultimate. We learned that it was in development and was canceled shortly after 4.1 was released and the Ultimate Coil of Bahamut was cleared. So the exact answer says, do you want us to die? Like, developing these things is, like, really taxing. Originally, we intended to release an Ultimate encounter in 4.5. We had begun development, but after we released UCOB, we realized that it was too intense, and people were... And they apparently received feedback, we've heard this before, that said that, you know, they were probably releasing them too frequently. We didn't know where that feedback came from. A lot of us were very confused because we didn't see that feedback. So we're all very much questioning, like, where this feedback came from and who in their right mind said it. But however, after the Weapons Refrain came out, they heard a bunch of cries for the next Ultimate when they initially announced 4.5 would not have one. And they kept saying, we want another Ultimate, we want another Ultimate, we want another Ultimate. And by that point, it was too late. They couldn't undo what they had already started canceling because they weren't in development of it anymore. So it was too late, but with that feedback, they are going to be taking that into consideration when developing the Ultimate series in 5.x. With that, I feel fairly confident that after how much outcry there was for the Weapons Refrain, with how popular it was on Twitch streams, both from a streaming and from a viewer standpoint, and also on YouTube, and just the general talk of Ultimate and the Weapons Refrain in particular, that hopefully they see that interest and they realize that even if a small percentage of players are completing that it is affecting a wider array of people that may not necessarily just be participating in it. And they really went into detail of this in the development panel with Yokozawa, where he talked about how the Weapons Refrain was actually made for people who stream Final Fantasy XIV. It was a really cool thing because we don't ever assume they're doing that for that reason. So fingers crossed that it ends up working out in such a way where we get 3 Ultimate encounters in the 5.x series, especially 5.5 leading into the expansion. Just having that one final expansion goal would just be so nice, but it won't matter for another 2 years anyway, so getting a little ahead of myself right now. But anyway, that is the press conference coming out of the Final Fantasy XIV Fan Festival from North America. Again, credit to Gamerscape for the write-up that I've kept on the screen so all of you can keep up. If you want to check out the article, I will include it in the description of the video. And Gamerscape is always posting all sorts of Final Fantasy XIV stuff, so be sure to check out their website on the regular for new news, if I don't have anything posted, of course. And a lot of the times we refer to them in our videos anyway. So anyway, that's also going to be a wrap for me. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned. We got plenty of pieces coming out about the Fan Festival, and we'll have plenty of information coming as more becomes available with patch 4.5 and Shadowbringers for Final Fantasy XIV. Anyway, I will see all of you in the next video, and until then, take care.